Hello everyone, this is Professor Hosselin. This is History 107. And today we're going to be talking about some transformations in Western Europe. Now, partly because of its growing world role and rising earnings from international trade, Western Europe changed greatly in the 3 centuries after 1450. Many of the items on a list of the key developments are quite familiar. The Renaissance, the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, the Price Revolution of the 16th century, the rise of absolutism, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment. These developments did not all neatly mesh, and other interesting episodes suggested some of the tensions involved with uneven and sometimes contradictory change. The witchcraft craze of the 17th century is a leading case in point. From a world history standpoint, there are two major issues. First, with all due credit to the growing importance of the West, it would be misleading to linger too long over the details of activities in a single society. Second, these changes must be placed in a world history context, compared with developments elsewhere, and assessed for their greater impact. The focus of this lecture, then, is on the big changes in the West and their larger implications for world history. This focus, in turn, calls for attention to growing commercialization in the economy, which paralleled the larger international role, the growth of state functions and the emergence of the nation-state, and a series of changes in both formal and popular culture, many of them revolving around the rise of science. So let's begin. The early modern centuries constituted an exceptionally busy time for Western Europe. The list of major activities during this time is formidable. The migration of the Renaissance to the north from about 1450 onward, the 16th century Protestant and Catholic Reformations, the Price Revolution, the rise of absolutism in the 17th century, the parliamentary monarchies that developed in Britain and the Netherlands, the scientific revolution, the 18th century Enlightenment. World history does not afford us the opportunity to spend as much time on these developments as we might in a Western civilization approach. How can we make this range of developments in Western Europe manageable enough to fit into a world history pattern? In this lecture, we'll take a big changes approach, looking at significant shifts in Western Europe between 1450 and 1750. Now, this approach does not do justice to all the individual movements and currents in Western Europe, but is necessary for understanding the bigger picture. We'll also look briefly at the global implication of these changes, and we'll evaluate these big changes in the West in terms of their placement among existing global standards. Now, big changes in the West in the early period fall into four categories. First is the increasing place of the West in world trade, and to a lesser extent in world power politics. From world trade, the West gained access to new individuals and perspectives, and new levels of wealth and commercial opportunity. Although we will focus on the other big three developments in the West, this repositioning in the world was a fundamental change in and of itself. The other three big developments involved an increasing commercialization of the Western European economy, increasing governmental efficiency and rationalization, and fundamental shifts in the cultural outlook. The first of these three is commercialization. During the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, more Europeans became involved in the commercial economy, producing at least some goods for sale on the market. In the early 17th century, southern French peasants, for example, and landlords began producing wine for sale to other regions, thus involving themselves in importing food for consumption. Villages began to specialize in certain kinds of production, and in both agricultural and manufacturing, ordinary people, as well as merchants and landlords, began to produce more for the market and to adopt an explicit set of market motivations and practices. Now, this meant a growing importance for the merchant class of Western Europe, which expanded and gained wealth from both international and domestic trade. The expansion of domestic manufacturing in Western Europe was also important. Under this system, rural people devoted more effort to producing goods for sale to merchants in nearby cities. Commercialization was also accompanied by a growing gap between the large numbers of people who owned property and the propertyless or near propertyless workers. European class structures shifted away from the community based relationships that had predominated in the post classical centuries or the medieval period. This change was accompanied by a new and harsher attitude towards poverty, even as early as the late 16th century. This commercialization of the European economy falls under the heading of a catch-up development. It brought Europe to economic levels that had previously been achieved in such places as China and other parts of Asia. By the 18th century, developments began to press beyond the catch-up level. The expansion of domestic manufacturing and the introduction of new technologies pushed the European economy beyond levels that had been achieved in other societies. Another 18th century development, recently uncovered, is the beginning of modern consumerism in Western Europe, predating the Industrial Revolution. The second category of development is politics. Until the 17th century, European politics can still broadly be described in terms of the early emphasis on feudalism. By the 17th century, though feudal remnants lingered, European states were beginning to develop a new range of activities and a sense of rationalization. Central governments now began to send out increasing numbers of bureaucrats to the provinces to ensure that central edicts were enforced uniformly throughout the realm and to monitor local conditions. At this point, national boundaries began to matter. New functions included such activities as cultural intervention. In the 17th century, the French monarchy, for example, established an institution to monitor and regularize the French language. And in the same period, European states began to set up prisons. Along with the expansion of function came rationalization, an increasingly self-conscious effort to think through how government activities were organized. The military serves as a prime example in the 17th century. Many European armies began to acquire uniforms, define officer grades, formalize training for officers, organize hospitals and logistical systems, and even establish pensions. Most of these developments were catch-up activities. That is, European governments were now beginning to do things that political systems in several other societies had already done, although again with particular European emphases. By the 17th and 18th centuries, however, we see an innovative twist, the clear beginnings of the idea of a nation-state, a state in which a shared culture and a tradition would exist with the state itself. The nation-state concept was a fundamental innovation in the world scene that would have a wide impact beyond Europe as well as within it. The third category of development is culture. The advent of printing in Europe opened up massive opportunities for Europeans to have contact with the written word. Literacy advanced systematically, and by the 18th century, Western Europe had the highest literacy rates of any large society in the world. The Protestant Reformation, despite some effective Catholic response, shattered the unity of Western Christianity and led to internal conflicts and tensions. In the long run, it tended to reduce religious commitment in Europe and promote some idea of religious toleration. During the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the range of scientific discovery and the increasing sense on the part of many intellectuals that the key to truth lay in science, not faith or tradition, was a fundamental change that no other scientific endeavor in other societies matched. If we combine science and printing and growing literacy rates, we can argue that of the three areas we've emphasized, commercialization, political change, and culture, it is culture that makes Western Europe stand out from other societies. The other intriguing aspect of cultural change in early modern Europe was the degree to which it penetrated into relatively prosaic activities and into the attitudes of relatively ordinary people. Between about 1600 and 1700, people had vastly different responses to ordinary situations, such as losing a valued object, naming a child, or embarking on marriage. Fundamental shifts in Western culture yielded impressive and varied expressions at the level of popular beliefs and practices, affecting the sense of the individual, the sense of family and community, and attitudes towards risk and nature. Now, Western Europe, despite all the exciting things happening there, was not the only place in the world. Many regions contributed or continued to ignore developments in the West, and some areas, by coincidence, saw a few developments that were not unlike those occurring in the West. Nonetheless, the changes that occurred in the West in the early modern centuries have three final implications. The big changes we've seen, governments taking on new roles, new attitudes towards nature, and even new attitudes towards children, almost guarantee that additional changes would occur in the West. Now, of course, the increasing pace of commercialization set the fundamental framework here. These changes would color European reactions to other societies. Europeans would think of other places as uncivilized because they did not measure up to Europe's new standards. And the development that occurred in the West set a challenging target for other societies. The complexity of the Western model would affect responses to Western activities in the wider world as well.